so much. It's amazing to see so many of you with us here on an absolutely freezing cold January Wednesday evening. So it's wonderful to have a crowd of people here. I hope that this will be a really informative and helpful session to really help get us thinking about how to make languages accessible to all, which is something I feel really passionate about, whatever age group we're talking about. It's something as a teacher and with all of my other experience within languages that I feel massively passionate about, particularly about taking away the stigma of making mistakes. Languages are communication and not having to be all about this sort of perfect fluent language, but actually communicating and having loads of fun with a language. So it's something I feel really strongly about. So I really hope to share some really useful things with you this evening that I hope will really help you with your own practice, and also help you with some reflections that you can take away to take back to your departments, to your colleagues, and just to really get the dialogue going. Because I think when it comes to SEND, it has to be a dialogue. There isn't one definitive answer. There isn't one definitive definition of anything. You know, at any one point, somebody might have a need that needs supporting. It might be temporary. It might be more established. You know, any of these things, in which case, you know, we have to adapt our practices continually to support the children we have with us. And this can vary drastically from year to year, from cohort to cohort. So it's something that is never answered. It's just an ongoing conversation that we always keep having. So it's always really useful to go back to look at the supporting evidence and documents to really get us thinking about this. So as those of you who know, who've been to our CPDs before, I'm Bethan, the project owner of the languages team. I come from an extensive language teaching background. I've taught from Key Stage 3 through to Key Stage 5 in Wales and England. I've worked in assessment, in examining, in CPD, in authoring, and everything around language education. And with my colleagues, we've got an enormous love of languages, a love of culture, and a real strong passion about helping primary teachers deliver languages. Languages can be absolutely terrifying for so many reasons, predominantly the fact that in the primary sector, teachers are often having to take on a language responsibility without a language background themselves. And it's something we feel really strongly in the team about, that we can support you with that. And as a result, an area such as SEND in languages can be overlooked, because languages can be overlooked. And then you sort of dialing back and finding all these areas within it. And it is something that, as a language specialist or as a language teacher within your school, that it's really important to consider how languages can impact children and how children can impact your teaching as well, how it kind of, you know, flips both ways on that. So I want to look at the 4 broad areas of need which have been identified by the DFE SEND Code of Practice, because essentially it makes sense to follow any official guidance with regards to that. But actually talking about what that means in terms of day-to-day teaching and learning, and what that means as a language teacher. I want to look at some practical strategies for MFL, just simple things that don't involve, I'm not going to go away and say, oh, make this worksheet or do that or do this, but just talking about how we can perhaps adapt our practice just to make it more inclusive and really help the children that we have with us. I want to touch on adaptive teaching. Adaptive teaching in itself is a massive area, and it's not something I could do full justice to, but I think it's something to consider constantly, because I know that you know there will be different policies in different schools and trusts on differentiation, but there is by and large a move away from that 3-way differentiation, which is something that many of us have had quite embedded in our practice for some time, and actually moving away now to kind of not having that, because that was just differentiation on paper in many respects, or different activities, and actually just adapting our practice, which obviously can be stressful in many ways, but it is a fantastic thing to do. So just to kind of chat about that. And as I've said, it is a dialogue. There isn't an answer that we can present on how to support every child in languages, because it isn't just about children who have an identified learning need, but also all children at some points will have differing needs, whether those are educational needs, behavioural needs, emotional needs. A child who's recently been bereaved, for example, may need short-term support or medium-term support, whereas a child who's got, further issues at home, or, this can range from anything from a child who is a young carer to a child who, for example, has what is a more sort of old school view of what SEND might be, such as, reading and writing difficulties, literacy and communication issues. Those are the sorts of things, the spectrum is so broad and vast here. We can't possibly begin to say, this is what you have to do to fix your teaching. But what you have to do is be aware of how things change, be aware of the children you have within your school community, and really being open to constantly developing your own practice, not to think, this is it, this is how I used to do it, but actually, okay, I might used to have done it like that. Maybe it's time to reflect and change again. And I'll just look at the end at how we at the Languages team can help you with some of the resources that we make. And also, as I'm always at pains to point out, we really try to support as much as we can. If there's a resource you feel you need, or you want something adapted, do get in touch. We do try to help as much as we can with that. So I want to start by looking at the Special Educational Needs and Disability Code of Practice, which basically is telling us that all pupils should have access to a broad and balanced curriculum. It sounds like common sense, but languages in particular is an area that sees children removed from lessons. They're withdrawn from languages to pick up support elsewhere. But actually, languages can be a level playing field, whether that's a child who's an EAL learner, or a child with all sorts of cognition difficulties, for example. Languages can be a level playing field, and actually it can be a chance for them to have fun and to sing some songs and to get active and have a great time with learning a language. So, not to feel that, oh, let's just take them out of French, that's too difficult. Actually, to take that stigma from languages away and actually say, well, no, because I feel that, within our team particularly, we're really strong advocates for making language learning accessible to all. And, as a result, this is true, it's obviously from the SEND Code of Practice, but for any subject, particularly languages, identifying areas of difficulty and addressing those, planning for what those difficulties might be and thinking how you can overcome those. And as I've been at pains to point out in any of the other CPDs, you look at the national curriculum for Key Stage 2 languages, there is nothing anywhere that says your children have to be able to write all this perfectly, to say this perfectly, to listen to this and understand everything. They don't. This is what we need to do. And I think it's about making adjustments to our expectations, not of learning and progress, but actually to who's in our class and, what we're delivering, to actually thinking, do you know what, languages isn't just about making sure everybody can count to 10 and everybody can say their name and say what the weather's like today. It's about learning about other cultures. It's a liberation from insularity that we see, within the national curriculum. So it's about supporting that. So, children can be affected by special needs in so many different ways. Some children, these needs may not actually have an impact on their learning, but you still may have to take account of that in your planning. For other children, you might have to make, far more physical adjustments to your practice. It could be as simple as just breaking things down into chunks to support working memory, or it could be things like dimming the lights in your classroom or altering things. It's all these sorts of things that we have to take into account, and we have to constantly adjust, because from month to month, from year to year, the teaching landscape is always changing. And within that, it's far more pupil-centered now. Adaptive and responsive strategies in the classroom are far more relevant and far more expected than your kind of more traditional three-way differentiation. We've got to look at what the barriers might be and find ways to adopt them. And barriers are not overcome by having a worksheet that's differentiated three ways. They're overcome by a supportive, nurturing learning environment that supports all children, whatever the subject, but obviously languages for me as that's my area. So, as I've said, a high quality languages education. This is, the scheme of work that the national curriculum for languages that I can certainly quote verbatim. I'm sure a lot of you can as well. But it's about fostering curiosity and deepening understanding of the world. And I think we have that commitment to every child. Just because a child has a learning need, it doesn't mean that they can't succeed and have success in languages. Our fundamental purpose as a language teacher is to foster this curiosity. It's to deepen children's understanding of the world. We really want children to recognise that diversity is a matter for respect and celebration. We live in a world of multiple cultures and languages, and celebrating that diversity is the most important thing of all. And that's more important about learning any list of vocabulary or anything at all, as far as I was concerned. And I say that despite having been a GCSE and A-level examiner and all of those things, I think the respect, the diversity, the knowledge about the world trumps every single time any mark on a page, any mark out of 10, any result. This is what we're trying to do, is just to say, look, there's a world out there. Let's find out some more about it. And it's an international world. So fluency isn't just about fluency isn't the only success criteria that we should be focusing on here. It's broadening horizons, learning about other cultures. Pete, my colleague who's here in the crowds this evening, came along to our Teach Me on Cultural Capital, the recording of which is on the website that you're free to go in and watch. But we talked about broadening horizons with cultural capital, and the role of that can really help engage children who may be finding it difficult to engage with the more traditional curriculum in other ways. So, we're trying to unlock this linguistic and cultural appreciation. So, the reality, of course, is that we have to identify and remove barriers to language learning. We are expected to know in our registers, to have a record, to keep track of what's going on. Now, it's super different. If you're a classroom teacher in primary school and you're teaching French as part of your weekly lesson, it's going to be really different because you know those children, you're with them 5 days a week. If you're the language specialist who's coming in over several lessons, it's very different because you're going to be teaching several classes. Or if you're a TA or HLTA supporting languages, again, it's going to be, your role is going to be very different within that. But fundamentally, it's being aware that SEND can affect the following. It can affect behaviour, ability to socialise, reading, writing, concentration, understanding, and also physical ability as well. So it's just being aware that you can't always see every educational need. And I think what's always really interesting to me is that obviously it's SEND and we have a SENCO in school. In Wales, where I live, it's actually called ALN, Additional Learning Needs, and it's an ALENCO for Additional Learning Needs Coordinator. And sometimes just, reframing things slightly can be really helpful to see that, because it's just a case of saying special educational needs or just a learning need, an additional learning need that needs to be addressed to help them access the curriculum. And I think there's a fantastic report that I would really recommend. It's a little bit old now. It's not brand new because it still talks about SEN rather than SEND, SEN rather than SEND. However, David Wilson's Language Learning and Students with Special Educational Needs, the link is in the chat there, is a fantastic report on language learning and special needs within the language learning classroom. And I think this was really powerful when I read this. The first sign of a need is simply a mismatch between what the curriculum's expecting and what the student's bringing to the curriculum. And I think when you frame it that way, it suddenly becomes a lot less terrifying. I used to teach in an inner city London school, and if you were teaching a bottom set class, your register would be filled with 20 different types of learning needs and different things that were there. And at first glance, this as a young teacher was really terrifying. You look at it and you think, how am I going to support these children? How can I make sure that this lesson works? This lesson even happens. How can I control the behavior? How can I manage all of this? And sometimes it's just reframing it as just saying, I've got an expectation, the children are bringing something, I've got to try and meet this in the middle somewhere. And that, I think, is really powerful and kind of really helps me put that in perspective as well, because we can't be all things to all people all of the time. We are not going to get it right all of the time. I'm I don't have a background as a Senko. I have an extensive background in teaching a range of abilities and a range of ages in modern languages. But what I do know is that I don't know everything. And I think that's my strength. I'm always willing to learn. And I think it's always thinking, okay, there's a different way of doing something. I need to pick something up. So, you know, before this session this evening, I spoke to Senkos from primary and secondary. I spoke to TAs and HLTAs. I spoke to classroom teachers, and just really to kind of unpick this from a language point of view, because you'll get whole school CPD on Send, but I wanted to really sort of unpick this for languages to make it really relevant. So in order to be able to kind of help us to label this for languages, and I'm reluctant to kind of pin anything into these things because I think it makes life really difficult, but the reality is we have to, and it helps us. But the Send Code of Practice does identify these 4 broad areas of need. And these are strands. Some children will overlap across different strands at different times. Needs will change, and there is never going to be one overarching definitive support structure that is perfect this. But if we break these down, if we break down the needs within these 4 areas, we can build a portfolio of strategies. And these strategies, if we have a list of things that we kind of go back and we try, okay, that didn't work, let me try this time. Well, brilliant. It's only going to help us improve our own practice. You know, it's only by failing and making those mistakes that we're going to get it better next time. And it's something that I think we can't possibly profess to know everything about every conceivable need a student in our class may have, but we can do our best to support them, and we can commit to always kind of being prepared to upskill our own pedagogy and our own knowledge to make sure that we know as much as we can about these areas. We've got a CPD video on this, which is an introduction. It's under 10 minutes, where I just go into these areas in a little bit more detail than perhaps I'm going to be able to tonight. But just quite a quick one that's quite useful for you to be able to watch within your departments that may be helpful. So David Wilson, again, as I said, I do, you know, if you have one takeaway today, I would go and read that. Read it over a coffee tomorrow morning in school. It's worthwhile reading. It does frame a lot of things, and it's really helpful. But it's something to bear in mind is that students with any form of learning differences or difficulties frequently suffer from poor self-esteem. And this is something to bear in mind. So any Send-friendly strategies that we can use can help improve that overall picture of school. If you can find some aspect of enjoyment or some aspect of engagement within languages, then and we can reach out to some children. Again, it's almost an impossibility to be able to kind of put everything on one page and say we can do everything for every child. Realistically, you know, I can't hand on heart tell you every strategy that's going to work, but you know, it is about trying to help arrest and reverse this decline and doing what we can to support these children that need our support to access our subject. So the first kind of area from the broad areas of need is communication and interaction. So just a quick look at how this is going to impact MFL. The Send Code of Practice, which is here, I'm not going to read that out, but that identifies a little bit more specifically how this, what this exactly means, how broad communication difficulties might be. In terms of languages, what this might mean is that children might find it really hard to use their voice expressively. And I mean oral repetition, things that are just you take for granted as part as a language teacher. Let's do some chanting, repeat after me. Children might find it really hard to join in with that. They might find it really hard to speak with an accent, or even recognizing or using the intonation in a foreign language. So for these children, you might just need to just reframe your expectations in terms of how else can they show their understanding. If you know they're struggling to repeat, can they mime? Can they do an action? Can they point at something? Does it have to be everybody repeating perfectly? It's just having that awareness in your practice. At a general level, for some children, learning and putting to use topic vocabulary could be challenging. So if you think about it, they're trying to translate something in their head from English, but they're struggling to find the English word in the first place. Then trying to convey meaning in a foreign language, can cause a huge amount of anxiety. You know, an instruction or a sequence can be really difficult if you're giving an instruction in a target language. So I am old enough to have lived through, let's all go full target language, let's pull it back and talk in English, let's go back in target, you know, and mix all of that. There is a place absolutely for talking in the target language, but I always feel I would rather children understood what I was saying. If you're going to cause stress by feeling you have to be speaking in French or Spanish or German or whatever you're teaching the whole time, take that stress away. It takes the stress away for yourself, particularly if you're not a specialist. Children, it will not impact their sort of short-term development within a language. You know, if they're hearing the language and they're exposed to it, you want them to understand what they're doing. You don't want them to feel anxious. If they sit there and they think, my teacher talks at me in French, I haven't got a clue what's going on. And this is not a case for any children who may have additional learning needs. This is a case for all children, quite frankly. You don't want them to switch off. You'd rather them listen. If you've got a sequence, you know, it may be better to explain it in English. So don't feel you have to be going into that fact. It's just about thinking of those things. Children who might struggle with imagination, so role plays, which are a bedrock of language teaching, they might find that really hard. So just to be aware of that, some children might need more context or, you know, just a bit more explaining with those sorts of things. So it's kind of having an awareness of that, really, so that you can adapt. And it isn't having to adapt and making, oh, I'm going to make a completely different role play for this group and a different role play for this group. It's not. It's just adapting your explanations and being aware. And if you're working with a TA in the classroom, that you know how to, you know, support this group is going to need a little bit more teacher input to help them work through it. It's just those sorts of things. So thinking about adapting our provision to support any learners who might have some needs around communication interaction. So pre-asking questions, and these kind of models are really popular now in particularly in secondary school. So they're great ones to kind of bring back. So rather than putting children on the spot, ask the question, put it on the board and say, later on, I'm going to ask you this question. Can you work out how to answer it? And then, you know, it may well be that if you know you've got a question to ask, this isn't a case of you having to make an entirely separate resource for a child. You can work with the TA in your class and say, I need them to be able to answer this at the end of the class. I need all children to be able to answer this question. This group of children here, I would really appreciate you to work with them before we start, just to look at some vocabulary. So pre-teaching some vocabulary. So in tomorrow's lesson, you're going to need these words. You're going to see these words. And sometimes it isn't a case of learning them. It's just the familiarity, the suddenness of it, and the anxiety. Thinking time. I think that's something that those periods of silence can be found really decent and fantastic. Mandy's just popped in the chat to pre-teach before the session when they know what's coming up. It's not always practical to be able to do it, but if you can, it's a brilliant thing. It's really helpful. If you're a language specialist going into a school, then it's brilliant if you can work with a classroom teacher to say, could you go through these things perhaps with these children first and just explain that this is what we're going to be doing. Just sometimes explaining what you're going to be doing first to take away that anxiety. Giving thinking time. We can be really scared of those periods of silence, but actually giving time, we kind of expect this kind of snap. Can you answer me? Well, is that really fair for these children who might need to think about something in English first, and then they've got to convert it to a foreign language, and then they have to think about it in their head, and then they have to say it out loud in a different accent, in a different kind of way of speaking? We have to be respectful of that. So give thinking time if it's needed. So here's the question I'm going to give you to answer. I'm going to come back to you. You've got 2 minutes to think about your answer. Give them some pair time to work on it. Visual cues where possible. And languages really lends themselves well to that because, you know, as you can see, I'm always waving my hands around about years of language teaching. But, you know, flashcards, pictures are absolutely standard kind of tools for teachers. And in fact, these days we're really reliant on interactive whiteboards and technology, but sometimes you can't really go wrong with an old flashcard to actually show something because they really help with understanding. So visual cues are fantastic. Word mats and knowledge organizers, providing children with these in advance, you know, given to everybody. They don't have to be just, you know, differentiated. Everyone will benefit from that. So you could work with the TA to possibly pre-teach and just break down those barriers first. And just, think about the language you're using and also the language you're teaching. Do you need to have all of these different words? You might cause some degree of confusion. Is there ambiguity in what you're saying or what you're showing? Just, ensure that your visual clues are clear. As I've said, I feel like I'm paying a lot of lip service to these because I could talk for an hour just on this alone. And there's so much that I kind of want to touch on to start the dialogue. And I feel if there are areas that you would like to explore in more detail, please do let us know in the feedback, because we will run more sessions like this. We will run more discursive sessions. We can have subject leader network meetings, and also we can create more CPD resources to support it. It's very much a case of you telling us what you need with regards to this, and if there are any particular areas that you would benefit from going into in more detail. The next area to look at is the challenges presented by cognition and learning needs. STEM Code of Practice says that children with cognition and learning needs may learn at a slower pace. They may have difficulties accessing or reading or completing written work. They may find it harder, and this is something to bear in mind, to responding to listening exercises because of working memory. And this is something that, again, as language teachers, we often just listen. It's like, listen, answer a question. Well, actually, for some children, they have to listen, try to retain that information, and then answer the question. It becomes several parts of that process. So it's just that awareness. And I must admit, that's not something, because teaching secondary, you have to teach listening. It's 25% of the course as it stands. So listening was non-negotiable. And I must admit, it's only in sort of recent years as practice evolved, I can think back to teaching thinking, gosh, I didn't really take the working memory into account. For some children, a listening exercise is a memory exercise. For me, as a linguist, I listen to it, I respond to it. Some children, they're learning and they're retaining it. It's very, very different. So just to be aware of that it might take them longer. So, yes, when they sit a GCSE in a language, they have a fixed amount of times they hear something. There is absolutely no reason. If you need to repeat something 10 times in primary school, repeat it 10 times. There is no need to say you can only hear it twice. It really doesn't matter. I'm at pains to point this out for Key Stage 3 as well, and even early Key Stage 4. It's only when you get closer to an exam you need to narrow that window down of how many times you listen to it. And if needs be, show a transcript. Again, we're just trying to develop an awareness of language. We're not expecting perfect fluency or perfect understanding. So don't feel you have to do that. There's no need. If there are barriers with listening, find ways to take them away. That's kind of the best thing to look at, really. So, for cognition and learning, visual aids, as I said before, can be, really important. If you've got word mats or knowledge organizers, try and minimize the text. Obviously, all of these kind of things with regards to font, size, background, that kind of thing would relate to any subject. But it's particularly important in language where you've got accents on words and the letters are unfamiliar, because you need that clarity so that children can see them and they can recognize those differences. Can we use technology to help children? So if they do struggle with short-term memory or memory processing, can you use technology in a way that might support them? So thinking of ways there. So plenty of partner time and partner talk time during lessons. So give them a chance. As I said before, if you've got a question, pre-teach that question. And this is how these needs are overlapping. Then you're thinking, right, I'm going to give you some time with a partner now to plan your answer, discuss that answer. Or just to feedback. Some children will find whole class responses overwhelming as they find it really hard to express themselves in public. That's not a special educational need. There are plenty of adults who feel the same as well. Lots of people don't like talking in public. So remember that, and don't feel that success is judged by how many times you see a hand go up. If they're communicating in a pair, then that's all you really need. Provide opportunities for pupils to join in. Can they feedback within small groups? If you have a TA with you, then split the class into 2 and feedback that way. Just those little ways, it's moving around. Just consider that, really. And, this kind of variation will really help with any behavioural issues as well. And don't underestimate, as I've said, the power of repetition. I said that's an intrinsic part of vocabulary learning. And if it's choral repetition, you do have to bear that in mind in terms of communication interaction. That may be difficult for some children, but essentially repeating knowledge and revisiting knowledge in small chunks is really helpful. Considering assessment is really important. And assessment, again, we've done assessments and assessment on their on assessment on their own, and we have teach meets on these that you can go back and revisit. But do think about how you're assessing the children in your class. How do you need them to demonstrate? It doesn't always have to be formal. Can children show their understanding with the teacher, not with the whole class? Could a deaf child have the exercise read to them by a teacher so they can see their lips moving rather than listening to a recording? Or it's just those sorts of adjustments constantly. Make notes on progress made in class too. So remember the principles of assessment for learning here. Assessment isn't just a formal test. Just seen a great comment here. Being able to adapt is a must. Yeah, it's a really great question. So how to go about teaching flexibly in correlation to language exams, I think is a great question. I always think you build towards it. So you start with that flexibility and you have that time scale in your head. So my own experience here would be based on, say, GCSEs and a time frame there. And I would base that, the clearest way to base that is on a listening kind of exercise where in the GCSE they can hear it twice. Well, why do they have to listen to it twice from the get-go? They can listen to it 15 times if needs be. And you say, right, now we're going to learn, and then you just kind of working slowly to chip away at it. So they have to understand, because life does involve a lack of flexibility. So all children have to understand there will be periods of life where there is no flexibility, such as exams, because they are, very structured and fixed periods of time. But it's about preparing them for that mentally and kind of just adjusting your processes. So you can start by being really flexible and fluid and say, right, we're going to have to narrow it now. You're not all going to like this, but we've got to narrow this down. We can't afford to listen to this 20 times. We can only listen to it twice. So, and then you do practice of that. Say, right, because we've got to narrow it down. We've listened to this text too many times. This time we're just going to do 5. And you just kind of slowly chip away at it. I don't think there's ever a right answer, but it's just about trying to chip towards that, really. So in your general broad classroom practice, to incorporate as much flexibility as you can. And then when it comes to some form of standardized or formal testing, that you are building in that preparation. Because for many children, it's the anxiety about the structure that is just as problematic as the content. So you do have to prepare for that as well. There has to be sort of realism there. And this brings me on sort of mentioning anxiety there, particularly with regards to any sort of formal testing in languages, social, emotional, and mental health difficulties, which can be a harder area to consider within the classroom, because these needs can be variable. They can depend on circumstances. They could potentially be resolved. They could potentially be ongoing. And I think a brilliant thing about modern society is that, generally speaking, we are far more aware of this now, and we are far more aware of how children are impacted by social, emotional, and mental health difficulties. And it's realizing that our lessons might cause children anxiety. They might cause them to worry. They might cause them stress, and it might, be as part of something else. So it's about trying to find ways to minimize any stress within our lessons, I always think, to help support any children who might need us there. And that is by building an inclusive learning environment, really. It's about ensuring that children are able to work with children that they are comfortable with. We don't have to force a group work situation. If you know that children are going to have a clash with a different child, don't feel you have to move them and do that. If they're going to struggle with certain things, look at ways of doing that. Think about, clear structures and expectations. Are you quite straightforward with when the lesson is? So is it very clear? If children are very anxious, might they find, and I'll talk about this later as well with sensory, but they might find the very loud noise of a language lesson with chanting and singing, that might cause anxiety. So you might need to think about that and how you can perhaps modify that. And, can you find ways of working so that children may feel a little more supported? can you look at perhaps sometimes carousel style activities, where children are moving around and doing things at their own time rather than it having to be teacher-led, language-driven. You've a huge amount of flexibility at primary school languages. Obviously, if you're within a trust, then you perhaps have different expectations and different styles that you must, to work with. But by and large, the primary curriculum from the national curriculum is extremely broad and does allow you a huge amount of flexibility to accommodate all learners. So, I think what's very important for anybody with any mental health difficulties is that you are clear, that they understand where they are. That sort of ambiguity can be really stressful. So ensuring that your explanations are clear, which is why going back to target language, that may cause more problems than it solves. So if you're giving an instruction in French, give it in English as well. It really doesn't matter. Do not feel that you have to do everything in French. If it's going to make your lives easier, your children's lives easier, do that. It's about giving them the reference tools, as we said, pre-teaching, anything that's going to make your classroom more inclusive. And then the last of the 4 broad areas of need are sensory and physical needs that, are related to areas that you might have to support them within the classroom. And these can vary quite dramatically, really. It can be as simple as a very visual need that you can solve, or you can work towards, or you can support, or it may be something that's far more complicated that you're never really going to resolve. So, and don't forget, this can be a child also who's broken their arm and has a temporary physical need. All of these are encompassed in this area. So, there will be support. And what we're trying to do is help children access our lessons. And I think as language teachers, these are particularly important, because anything we do to help some children will help all children. And it's about, helping children feel relaxed and safe in your classroom. Visuals and lighting are really important. Are the lights really bright? If you've got loads going on and flashcards and flashing things and a PowerPoint and all of this, it might be really overwhelming. Also, for mental health difficulties, it could be really overwhelming. So consider that, have you got all these flashcards in crazy primary colors? Is it all really exciting? Think about those sorts of things, really. For some children, it can be just a case of lighting, harsh classroom lighting. Obviously, that's an issue that goes beyond languages, but you might have to think of your position if you're standing in front of a window for the lighting for them to be able to see you. They may struggle with shade, for example. It's those kind of things. But what we're trying to do in any circumstances is build an inclusive learning environment where children feel safe, and that children feel safe to make mistakes. They're not going to be laughed at for trying out French and Spanish. They're not going to feel self-conscious, and they're going to be able to join in. And this is what we want to do. So it isn't kind of saying, oh my gosh, here's 3 worksheets, a top, middle and bottom, you're going to get one of these, that's you pigeonholed. It's about saying, I understand that there are going to be differences within a group of 30 children, the same, let's be honest, as there would be with 30 adults. And you accommodate those needs. You think as an adult, if you're going to a conference, you would get asked straight away, do you have any access needs? Are you vegetarian? Have you got any food intolerances? All of these sorts of things that you might need. Do you need an interpreter? Might you need this, that? We're asked all of those questions. They have become standard practice now. So the same that you've got to make a vegetarian meal for somebody coming to an event to tolerate for that, then just being prepared to be flexible, to find ways to work to support children, is always going to be helpful. We have a range of videos and packs that can really help you with many different ways to kind of look at practical strategies to kind of work on that. Again, practical strategies, I could have talked, as I've said, all day about this, but it's things like, choral repetition might be a huge amount of stress for some children. Don't feel every child. If they feel they're happier just miming, I think back now and I cringe to telling off a child for not joining in with choral repetition. They may not have been being naughty. They might have just found it really difficult. And it's just that kind of awareness, it's being prepared to modify those things really, and knowing about that. But we've got some videos and some packs that are really helpful, so do take a look. And if there's anything that you feel you'd like to know more on, you know, we're more than happy to do that research and put those resources together for you. So, you know, please do think about that. Something that I do think about languages as well, just moving on, is just thinking about, as I said, minimizing anxiety, remembering that group work can be stressful. They might prefer to work always with the same group, and us mixing things around or making children move around the class and have conversations can be really stressful. Moving from pair work to group work and back, those simple transitions can be stressful. Now, they'd be stressful in any subject, but they might be exacerbated in a language where we do far more of those sorts of activities. You know, monitor how your groups are working. You know, think about rest breaks, think about those sorts of things. You know, think about boundaries, think about your clear expectations, and just making sure that, you know, you're doing what you can to help children. Just modify your expectations, not in terms of achievement and access to language, but modify your expectations with regards to not everyone can join in, as I've said, with call or repetition. Not everyone is going to feel comfortable. Not everyone's going to find it easy to do a role play, but that doesn't mean they can't access a language, and that doesn't mean they can't love language learning and they can't really enjoy it. We just want to avoid some stress, really, you know, and avoiding those kind of perceptions and the stigmas. The last thing I want people to ever think is languages are difficult, they're only academic, they're not for me, I can't do them. And it's no, we want to do what we can to minimize that and to avoid that feeling. Please, you know, I'm conscious that I'm sort of going at breakneck pace to all these, but there's such a lot to cover in a short period of time. If you do have any comments, questions, or anything, please do pop them in the chat. It's super helpful and it's lovely to hear your experiences. So I want to consider very briefly as well adaptive and responsive teaching. This, as I've said, is an area that I could, you know, you could put a whole day together talking about adaptive teaching, but this is the way that teaching is moving in terms of our expectations. Everything is far more pupil centered with regards to how we're planning and delivering these days, and this means that adaptive and responsive teachers strategies are far more prevalent in any case, but also they work really well for languages, which is brilliant. In fact, it now forms part of the early career framework for the DFE standards for teaching. So Ofsted look for it as well. So being mindful of adaptive teaching strategies is really helpful. And I think the best thing you can put together to help work with children with SEND is a portfolio of strategies that you can use, that you can try. Not that you have to go away and plan different worksheets for everybody or different things, but actually you have a range of strategies, a range of questioning techniques, a range of tips, things that you can look at and go back to and try out or suggest and share and constantly add to. So a really great definition of adaptive teaching that I've seen, which is setting the same ambitious goal for all students, but providing different levels of targeted support. An old school, for want of a better word, three-way differentiation has got different outcomes and different expectations. We're saying we've got the same expectation, but what we're looking at is supporting you to get there. And I think that's a really lovely way of looking at things. The early career framework for the DFE explains in a bit more detail what's expected of beginning teachers, but actually this is relevant for all teachers. And I think for anyone who's been teaching for a long time, it's really helpful to go back and look at these, because you think, oh my gosh, yes, it's true. You know, thinking about children learn at different rates, regardless of any educational needs. All children will learn at different rates. As teachers, we always have to seek out and understand those differences, accept there are differences, and it's trying to knock down barriers to learning, which I think is a really positive way of looking at it, is that there are barriers for children to learn my subject. How am I going to help knock them down? You won't always knock all of them down, and you won't always get it right. But if you try, it's always going to be better than not doing anything at all. You know, and it's targeted support to pupils who are struggling. Generally, that's got to help. That's got to move things forward. Adapting is always going to lead to an increased chance of success. Again, from this, just some really, really useful points. If you read through those, they really force us to really reevaluate that differentiation. particularly that, you know, 3-way worksheets, for example. Learning styles. When I first started teaching, this was, oh, wow, learning styles. Are you a visual, auditory, a kinesthetic learner? Well, that's all been debunked now. And it's a case of, you know, no, we're not seeing that as a way to do it. That the evidence is not supporting that. But sometimes you pick these things up and there are elements of everything that add together to think, do you know what? There are elements I can take from there. So don't feel you have to throw everything away from differentiated worksheets or ways of working and ways of learning and different learning styles, but adapt it, incorporate it, move forward with it. Don't, you know, don't be afraid to learn new things and move from that, really. You know, it's adaptive teaching as an evolution of differentiation rather than a replacement, and this is, you know, a really positive way of viewing it, really. And it's making our communication clear and ambiguous and accessible. As I've said before, teaching languages can mean that your instructions might be in the target language. So how can you reinforce it? Can you give visual cues? Can you plan? Can you pre-ask? You know, avoid really complex vocabulary. How can you really help with these sorts of things? Now, great question here from Natalie. So I think Natalie's probably referring to our Twinkl Planet lessons, which a lot of them have 3 levels of activity. This is absolutely true. They do all have the same goals. So I think it's a strange one. They are definitely differentiated in so much as we're saying, and we have called them, there's 1-star, 2-star and 3-star. With our new scheme of work that we're currently developing, and I'm very much hoping to get lots of you on board with that to help try out lessons for us to become sort of ambassadors for those scheme. We are moving away from that 3 levels of activity and having suggestions for how you can adapt and suggestions for how you can be more flexible, so there is far more fluidity and less rigidity in it. I guess there is still always a benefit to these sorts of things, and I don't think they're ever wasted, but it's just a different way of thinking. That I think it's a case of moving on from that. So if we were making those exact lessons now, would we exactly make them the same? And no, we probably wouldn't. Would I teach the same lesson I taught last week? No, I teach it again differently. So it's evolving it. So Natalie, it's called Lightning Languages, which is our new scheme that's coming out for French and Spanish. We're going to have Key Stage 1 lessons. We're going to have Lower Key Stage 2 and Upper Key Stage 2. We're hoping to have the first units coming out in late spring, early summer, with a launch of more in September. And excitingly, there's going to be an app as well for kind of word games and eventually sentence level games. We're going to incorporate various principles of learning, as well as sentence building, Rosenshine's principles, you know, various different strands from different pedagogies and methodologies that I really enjoy learning more about, to try and make it as valuable as we can. So you know, if anybody is interested in being in kind of sort of steering groups and testing these out with their classes, we'd absolutely love to hear from you. So do pop that on the feedback form if you like, and it'd be great, because I'll be in touch with some trial packs for you to give these a go, so you can give us some feedback, and we'd absolutely love that. But certainly there is a value in those kind of, yes, it will be ultimate Twinkl subscription when they come out, but yes, definitely, if anyone else is interested in knowing more about this and being part of the journey with us as we evolve this product, then we'd absolutely love to have you try to take it. Oh, we've got a question here. Tracy, I'd love to answer your question now, but I'm conscious that I wanted to kind of wind up towards the presentation for the moment, and I'll take questions at the end. So if it's something I can kind of answer as I'm going along, please pop it in the chat. Otherwise, I'll answer any questions at the end, if that's okay. So thinking, as I was just saying, about adaptive teaching and just some strategies, just, you know, as I said, an inclusive learning environment, you know, on those sorts of things, multi-sensory approaches, working with others, how we're doing that. And we've got a video on this in more detail. As I've said, adaptive teaching is something I'm just literally scratching the surface of here. But really, we want to build towards motivation and enjoyment. So, you know, thinking about all of these areas and how we can support children and adapt our practice. And if this is something you feel you'd like to know more about, as I've said, we have got a video talking more about it. Or if you feel there's value in an entire session on adaptive teaching, then I'm very happy to run that as well and talk about it in more detail to talk about. So adaptive teaching is saying effectively, I think it would really helpfully address what Natalie said as well, which is that should things be adapted or differentiated? What about the stuff that we've got, which is three-way? What do we do with it? Well, it's a really good dialogue to have, because anyone who's been teaching longer than about 10 years will know anything comes full circle and you'll see it again. So I certainly wouldn't bin them, because they'll come back round again before we know it. And there is always a value in sometimes going back to those. Sometimes you do need them. But I've been doing a lot of work with the home education community recently. And what's really interesting, because they're teaching a range of children at home of different ages, they've said they prefer choice to differentiation. So they might like to see different things, and that you've got a broad expectation. And that's really kind of opened our eyes to ways of doing things as well, that it isn't just a case of saying, I want this one worksheet done three ways, I'm going to cut out some words and make it a little bit easier. It's actually about saying, well, no, I want the same level of challenge, but I'm going to support you a little bit more in getting there. So it's just ensuring that we do that, really. As I've said, I've got a video on that. It's under 16 minutes. It's quite a long one. It's me wittering on there. And again, I could probably have made it longer still, but it is a great introduction to that. And then if you do have questions, do get in touch. Fantastic. Mandy is mentioned about EAL children there. I've actually just recorded a podcast with the EAL team on EAL within MFL, and how this is such a fantastic area to help really develop our practice, because learners of English bring such fantastic enrichment to the classes, and it's really exciting. As I said, I was really hoping to have a guest speaker here this evening, but middle of January at 7 o'clock was probably a graveyard slot to be a bit optimistic to get anyone here. But I did chat with some colleagues who are Senkos, former Senkos, teachers in secondary schools, TAs in pupil units, to get their input and their opinion here. I got some variety here, but songs were really positive. Playing to children's strengths, praising where you can, but having support and scaffolding ready. Not putting limitations on what they can achieve. And I think that's the area that we want to move away from with a differentiated worksheet. If it's a supported differentiated worksheet with the same goal, then that's different. But if we're saying we want you to do something different at the end of it, you're placing a limitation on there. And it's saying, don't put that limitation on. Don't say, oh, you're not going to be able to do as much. Why is that the case? It's a new subject for everybody. You might be surprised. Also, remember, it's not just about reading and writing. Sometimes it can be seeing the board, physically accessing resources. So just having that in mind, which can be tricky if you're a peripatetic teacher coming in, because you have to adjust constantly to a new classroom. Also, this is a really interesting one, and this came from a friend of mine who is a TA in a pupil unit in a secondary school, and where the pupils work within this unit constantly. She said they have a really negative attitude to languages because they are aware of their own limitations in English. And I thought this was such a hard thing to hear, because you want to be able to go in and say, oh my gosh, it's a clean slate, you could give this a go. And the learning needs to be hands-on and fun. So, those are all definitely great ideas, and, really helpful to kind of think about that. So do chat with a Senko, chat with other colleagues, find out what people have done, what works, build a bank of strategies. That's the best thing you can possibly do. There isn't one thing that's going to work in every classroom, but a bank of strategies that you can try. Got some top tips from all of these teachers. Getting active is a great one. We've got some new videos actually where we have some songs and singing. As I've said, this might be stressful for some because they might not like the visuals and it might be too much. So it might be too much stimulation. So do bear that in mind. But getting active with language learning can be fun. Integrating it with PE, for example. Pete, my colleague, is working on a blog on this at the moment. So we'll have that coming out soon. Which is great for some sort of CPD over a coffee. His blogs are always really fantastic for quick insight. If you haven't got time to read a full pack or watch a video, reading a blog with your coffee is a great way to get an insight into an aspect of learning. So getting active is great. Lindsay, who some of you will know, she is in our team and is a secondary teacher, reminded me of the strategies of think, pair, share, which is going back to what we're saying, that you've got some thinking time, you then have some pair time, and then you share things as a pair to take the pressure away. Pose, pause, pounce, bounce, which I have to admit I had never heard of, and I had to go and look that up, which is you kind of passing things along. So you pause, you pose a question, you pause and give them time to do it. You pounce and somebody has to give an answer and then bounce that along. Well, he said this. What do you think to that? What do you think to that? Do you add to that? What can you bring to it? And you sort of bounce it around, which are really successful strategies in the secondary classroom. Mini whiteboards are always brilliant because children are never as afraid to commit on a whiteboard that they can be to paper and pen. So, because you can just erase it instantly if you've made a mistake. But also remember that send doesn't always mean struggling to access. Send can mean accessing more. And actually some children may, be really quick at processing things, and they may work quicker, and they may need extensions and challenging tasks. So it's about not setting limitations and just assuming that send means they won't get to the end. It might mean they get to the end and beyond. Sticky notes, the same as mini whiteboards, are always really great. Spotting mistakes are great. Children, love to see teachers making mistakes, so put mistakes on the board for them to spot and to correct. And this can be really helpful as well, because it's you modeling a mistake and you're saying, it's okay, I've made a mistake, can you spot it? I don't mind if you make a mistake because I'm making them too. And I'm always at pains to point this out. I am not French. I am not Spanish. I love French. I love Spanish. I love the countries. I love the languages. I don't always get it right. I am not a native speaker. I will make mistakes. Therefore, how on earth can I expect children not to make mistakes? It's constantly putting that out there and not being afraid to say that. And lastly, wait times, not something that always comes easy to us, because we're like, come on, give us the answer, go, 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 quick fire. We haven't got much time. But actually, they might need that processing time. It's giving that processing time and giving that there. Again, if you have anything, please do pop them in the chat. And if you've got questions, once we've stopped recording, I'll stay on the call at the end to answer any questions and discuss anything at all. But just to remind you that we've got, as I've said, our growing CPD range, which is responding to your needs and what you're asking for. If there's something you feel you need, ask us. If you need a subject specific CPD that's there, we've got a free taster pack which will lead you to some of our videos and bits and pieces that are there. Emily will share the link in the chat for you. You can see we've got taster pack there, so you can have a look at what's there and at our CPD area. We've also got, packs and videos and various things that will support teachers, TAs, anyone who's involved in the teaching of a language, really. And it's an area I'm particularly keen on, because I'm well aware that many TAs not only support languages but deliver languages too. So that is something that I'm very keen on supporting. And if there are TAs here watching today, please do put it in your feedback sheet, because we do read those and I do use that to uniform. And I am going to be looking over the next month or so the plans ahead. We've got our titles coming up for the rest of this year, but I am looking ahead to next year's CPD, and I want to make sure that it is relevant and it does support your needs and what you're asking for. As well as that, outside of languages, there is obviously Twinkl's own inclusion area, and you can find there's a link in the chat to their CPD as well, which may also be helpful for wider issues beyond languages. We've also got these concept videos that can be really helpful. We've got them on some culture areas, we've got songs, and we've got grammar, which may be really useful for children who are struggling to access things. It would also really help, to look at that. Fantastic comment from Jasmine. They're saying, speaking to a speech and language therapist, ask them questions if they've got any strategies. What a brilliant idea. It's asking questions, picking up those strategies and adding them to your repertoire. I think that's absolutely brilliant tip. We've also got interactive games, which are fantastic for little group work and for reinforcing and repeating language. And you've got instant success, instant feedback. You know, they can be a really fun way to help embed language and help children feel that they are succeeding. Those can be really nice as well. And just finally, just with the article that I do, sort of, if there's one takeaway from today that you do go away and read this article, students identified as having special needs routinely grow up with a sense of being different from their peers. However, the study of MFL may lead them to recognise that diversity is a matter for respect and celebration in a world of multiple cultures and languages. And I think that's absolutely awesome. And if you only teach one thing, that there is, you know, a world beyond this classroom, and that there are other languages, there are other cultures, people do things differently, people are different, then I think you've succeeded. And, you know, to take yourself away from that stress of thinking, I must tick off this item of vocab, I must tick off this grammar. Absolutely not. You are delivering the opportunity to explore, to learn more, and to develop a, you know, a genuine love of culture beyond our own sort of remit. And I think that's the most important thing of all. So thank you so much for joining us this evening. I really appreciate so many of you coming along, particularly in the middle of January on a cold, miserable evening. It's been wonderful to have so many of you here. I will be staying on the call now, so if anyone's got any questions, please do feel free to put your hand up and I'll answer them, or anything that you want to discuss in more detail, or if anybody wants to find out any more about our new schemes or anything at all, please do hang around. But thank you so much for joining us. Our next Teach Meet in February is going to be on the joys of deep dives and inspections. So I'll have a colleague with us who's, you know, recently been through one of those, and she'll be talking a little bit more, not only about what's expected, but actually protecting your own mental health and preparing for that, which I think is even more important, in all honesty. So thank you so much for being with us this evening. We really appreciate it. Don't forget to fill in your feedback form to get your free mug. You will get this video sent to you, and also a reflections document, which will have copies of all the links as well.